the workplace, all kinds of social arrangements, especially civic organizations, particular organizations concerning religion. In that sense, it is also very much concerned about power and the symbolic control, especially how power is exercised, the ritualized way of exercising power in modern society. And this tradition has been going on, especially in the West, for the last 15, 20 years, a very powerful, one of the most powerful traditions in our modern times. I would consider feminist sensitivity as important as ecological consciousness. But then, of course, we also take into consideration of religious pluralism and the quest for global ethic. We may say that all axial age civilizations, not just Confucianism, but Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, of course later developed as an axial age civilization, Islam, Judaism, all these traditions will have to reformulate their value orientations in light of the feminist critique. So the Confucian case is one of those cases. But it's the case which occurred very early in modern history, as early as the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century. Some of the most powerful critics of the Confucian tradition in China were the proto-feminists in East Asia. So the first question we need to address, we're now not talking about Confucianism simply as a historical phenomenon. That could be very easily critiqued, but also as evolving ethic, even relevant to us today, and of course the potential to readjust itself according to new challenges from the outside. In this light, that historical record itself is very important. Confucianism, in a way, has been thoroughly deconstructed because of iconoclastic, meaning anti-traditional forces in East Asia, in China in particular. Some of the feminist critiques were the most prominent. So we're not talking about the Confucianism as a historical phenomenon, but we're talking about Confucian ethic as we understand it in this particular context. How do we critique it? And is there a way that a tradition will be able to respond creatively to the critiques, to the criticism, and in a way to find points of convergence? This is the purpose of this exercise. Still, we're confronted with a very serious challenge. That is the characterization of Confucian humanism in general as a gendered discourse. This is still very popular among sinologists. In other words, it's difficult to imagine a sage, a worthy, or a profound person or gentleman in the feminist context. This basically is a point that I would like to argue against. I would consider these notions about human flourishing, the highest manifestation of humanity as a sage or as a worthy or as a profound person, true to the Confucian intention, should be open to everyone. There's no reason to argue that only a man can become a sage, a woman cannot become a sage. I'm talking about a contemporary context. Right? Or the man can become a gentleman and a woman can never become a profound person. The historical fact that the sages or worthies or gentlemen in traditional society, traditional Chinese, Korean and Japanese society, were confined to the male sex does not necessarily invalidate the argument that sagehood, moral flourishing are open to every human being. You say, well, this sneaky suspicion that when the word human being was used, these people only had the educated male in mind. We will not be able to test that. In other words, if we got a Wang Yangming or Zhu Xi or Mencius, Confucius here today, would they insist upon their original position? No. It's a very fascinating issue. In other words, in interpretation, we know what is stated. We try to imagine the meaning of that statement. We also try to think, should that statement be made true to its intention in that particular fashion in a different context? We sometimes even argue if they knew the situation, they would have a different project or different orientation. This is not to whitewash what actually happened as a historical record, but it's to exercise our imagination to see what's going on in that particular context. Now, for example, in Buddhism, there's a statement, if you want to attain nirvana, because the notion about transmigration, many, many lives will have to be spent in order to reach that stage of nirvana. So in the Buddhist scripture, there's a notion that a woman will have to be born a man before she can have the opportunity to enter into nirvana. But now in modern Buddhist thinking, most of the scholars will say, well, there's so many lives we have to spend in order to attain nirvana. This same situation applies to both men and women, even to animals in general. So they broaden that scope and to try to make the gender differentiation muted. Not that it's not still significant, but try to make it muted. So that's one issue. The other very, very powerful issue is the whole question, the family, the Confucian conception of the family is in fact a male-oriented, family itself is a male-oriented practice. In other words, the family is the forum, the arena for the perpetuation of male domination. Many of the Confucians were so worried about this criticism. One of the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century Confucian thinker by the name of Tu Wei-ming, I just want to mention one name, certainly one of the most powerful defenders of the Confucian tradition, was so worried about this criticism, he accepted the notion. And the family, he considered, is really the arena where very, very unhealthy old practices were allowed to be continued. So he decided to argue against the 5 relationships. All 5 relationships, from his point of view, are somehow unworthy of continuous discussion. So he argued very forcefully that all 5 relationships, all relationships will have to be eliminated. The ruler, the minister, the father, son, husband and wife, older brother, younger brother, siblings. The only relationship within the 5 relationships that considered worth preserving is friendship. So he wants to reduce all relationships to one relationship. That's friendship. Of course, if you do that, family is not going to continue. So in other words, a very radical, quote, Confucian response to the feminist critique is to eliminate family as a basic arena for the cultivation of human values. That was more than a century ago. In the last 50 or 60 years, there's a different kind of thinking, even in the United States, different kind of thinking. So then the question is whether age and gender differentiation, the age and gender differentiation within the family itself is the very basis of a certain kind of unequal, therefore male-dominated orientation. We need to talk about it. That's a fascinating problem. I simply want to know there's a difference between highly politicized idea of the family as the cultivation of ethics for the service of the state. In other words, the notion that family stability is the basis for social solidarity, and social solidarity is the basis for political order. Because of this link between family and social stability and political order, the preservation of the family stability based upon certain kind of hierarchy of control is considered valuable. Some societies in East Asia argues that case. And that use of Confucian ethics is, I think, it's a highly politicized use. And I'm basically against that. But to fight against that is not to undermine the importance of differentiation, especially the differentiation in terms of age. You just cannot say, well, we have total equality in terms of age, out of the question. And also the question of gender. But still, this is the strong belief that there's some kind of built-in educational elitism within the Confucian discourse. You have to spend the time to study the classics, the whole idea of scholar official, and this commitment to certain kind of learning biased against one sex in favor of one sex and bias against the other one. And this argument against Confucian educational elitism is really related to any form of elitism, especially in scholarship. For example, science as a calling. This has been going on for quite some time. Many scientists, very good educators as scientists, strongly argued that the graduate school is almost like the monastic order. If you want to enter into graduate school, you have to devote totally to scholarship. And in that sense, it is biased against many other modes of thinking. Almost all scholarship becomes a kind of a commitment to a monastic order, to a lifelong process of learning based upon certain arrangements within the society, like priesthood. And should the priesthood be open to other segments of the society or not? But still, the question of hierarchy, authority, and status. The principle of differentiation is the principle of differentiation necessarily intertwined with the necessity of hierarchy, authority, and status. Especially the whole question about the distinction between the domestic and the public. In the classical Confucian tradition, I think it's outmoded, I believe, and the change can be very dramatic to the Confucian project. That is, women ought to be concerned about the domestic affair, domestic order, the role of child rearing, household work, and so on. Men should be in the public arena. This division of labor, of course, based upon very deep-rooted Confucian belief in differentiation, husband and wife, is the relationship is judged by a sense of division. And it's now outmoded. Now, it's possible for the wife to become public and husband to become domestic. In other words, the husband as the homemaker, taking care of children and so forth, and the wife is the breadwinner. But if that differentiation is allowed, should the differentiation itself, the principle of differentiation itself, be also fundamentally changed? Should there be differentiation or no differentiation? That's a very interesting and important issue. Then the question of power. Of course, power and influence. One observation which is correct is to say that the notion of the mother, the wife, and the daughter, the mother and wife and the daughter in the Confucian role differentiation played a very important role in changing society, in the maintenance of order. And that in itself is intrinsically unacceptable. This, of course, leads to a rather interesting issue about the yin-yang model. Yin is the female principle, yang is the male principle. Let's try to decouple the yin-yang model with the question of male and female in terms of social roles. Just focusing on the yin-yang model briefly. The yin-yang model specifies these two forces, the primary forces in the universe, are both conflictual. There is tension, but also complementary. There's a complementary in the sense that it's impossible in terms of the human person. Imagine someone who is just pure yang without yin. And it's difficult to imagine anyone is pure yin without yang. So every human being is endowed with both the male and female forces with different kind of orientations. So the category is much more fluid. And it's important to see the tension remain creative. The tension can also become destructive within one person. You can say, in terms of relationship, the superior, the boss, is the yang force. And the subject is the yin. In terms of influence, the people who have more influence is the yang. People who have less influence is the yin. If the boss is woman, and the subject is man, then the woman has more yang over the man who is yin. So the yin-yang model in this case is not sex specific. sexual specific. It is basically a principle that works within the society. So then the question, if it is not possible for us to imagine a society without certain kind of hierarchy, within certain sense of authority, and of course, status. So the question is not simply to fight against Confucian male orientation. This is certainly important. But also, at the same time, to recognize the necessity of differentiation, so the differentiation will be more acceptable, will be more humane, if the differentiations are going to stay. They will not be overcome. So the exercise of power in this case is an issue. It is not specifically gendered. The question of power is related to how you exercise power and how you do it without sacrificing the notion about differentiation. You allow the different kind of situation to occur, and you exercise power with consideration for all parties concerned. So in this sense, we see the feminists worried about the Confucian tradition as a specific case in terms of its overall orientation. It's somewhat gendered and male-oriented in terms of family ethics, in terms of educational elitism, and the sense of authority and exercising power, especially symbolic power, to have this association, authority, leadership with male qualities, submissiveness with female qualities. These are deep worries. But the feminists are much more worried at the same time about the Enlightenment mentality of the modern West. In fact, if you look at the feminist tradition in terms of a whole spectrum, this Franco-feminism or Anglo-American and so forth, most of the Western feminists are deeply concerned about the emerging modern ethos. We characterize it as the Enlightenment mentality. And their critique of the Enlightenment mentality help us to understand their worry about the Confucian tradition, and maybe we're able to identify points of convergence. Now, they first worried in terms of the Enlightenment mentality about excessive emphasis on liberty. They want to put more emphasis on the issue of equality and justice. They're worried about excessive individualism, aggressiveness, litigiousness, instrumental rationality, rights without duty and responsibility, and also the idea of the person as an isolated individual. If you look at the spectrum of the various kinds of feminist literature, I think it's fair to characterize that they are deeply concerned about these issues. And these are very powerful intellectual forces or ideological forces in the modern West. So the first order of business is a sense of fairness. The fairness involves some very specific designations, specific reading of what it means by fairness. For example, a new definition of work and compensation. Should child rearing or household work, all these, be considered as serious work in the life world? Or should only work in the office, gainful employment, be considered serious? The other types of work, you sacrifice, you do it, and you never get compensated. Is it fair in terms of the human flourishing broadly defined? If and especially, how do we honor highly routinized work? It's not a heroic expression of humanity. It is not simply creative work in the arts and literature, but it's in the ordinary sense, the maintenance of a household, of a particular office, of a society in general. Is it fair that we honor one type of work and pay extremely well, and some other types of work that are absolutely necessary for human, not just survival, for human flourishing, are totally marginalized as unnecessary or not important? If we use an instrumental calculus to link compensation with a certain kind of economic productivity, without taking into consideration of the society as a whole, we are actually exercising instrumental rationality at the expense of being reasonable. In other words, can we make a distinction between being reasonable in the sense of reasonableness and instrumental rationality as a clear calculation which can even be quantified according to the means and end? If we focusing our attention on reasonableness, we will privilege the importance of sympathy and compassion. We'll consider patience, the ability to tolerate ambiguity or ambivalence, the psychology of patience, the importance of receptivity, or sometimes we call the art of listening. These are non-quantifiable. It's difficult for us to quantify how this virtue actually exercised, but it has really great benefit for social cohesiveness, for social harmony. With these values, how can these values be underscored as important, rather than exclusive concern about a kind of a mechanical calculation based upon instrumental rationality? So they raise a very serious challenge about not only how you honor work, how you understand what is equal, what is not equal, what is just, what is not just, but also how you honor some other values that we cherish in the society that are not considered particularly significant. And closely linked to this is this a very powerful argument against the litigiousness, against the transaction cost for lawsuits, for argumentativeness, for aggressive assertion about one's own position. In other words, there's emphasis on capacity building, not simply to get it right or wrong according to certain kind of abstract rules. They argued against abstract rules and regulations. They're much more concerned about the actual situation in which the human life experience is considered central. Litigiousness, in a way, is diametrically opposed to a sense of civility and decency. If the emphasis is on harmony or equilibrium, now not harmony and equilibrium in a very passive sense, but it's a dynamic, transformative equilibrium and harmony of society. And it is dependent upon the ability to cultivate ethical intelligence, to put more emphasis on the feelings of the people involved. Now, this stereotypical notion about women are more intuitive or men are more rational is not what I have in mind. It's not that kind of distinction. It is culturally constructed. It may not be persuasive in terms of actual analysis. But most of the feminist movements will consider the values of civility and decency so superior to a sense of litigiousness defined in terms of the right, in terms of the correctness, according to a certain kind of legal constraint. And since most of the feminists are future-oriented, they're interested in education, interested in education for generations to come, they're also putting a great deal of emphasis, again, not the stereotypical notion about nurturing on the one hand and some kind of aggressive assertion about one's will on the other, but a great deal of discussion on responsibility nevertheless. And it's been discovered, it's quite interesting by many developmental economists. The best way to deal with development, especially for society, there's a conflict between overpopulation and economic resources for distribution. The best way out is the education of women. If you want the population, you want the population not to increase in a way that will totally undermine economic development. There's birth control, there's all kinds of other mechanisms. But the surest way, in terms of long-term perspective, is the education of women. once that becomes, that's a capacity building. Once they know that they have more capacities for developing themselves, have a broader view of what's going on, the demographic trend goes down, and the society is able to move towards that direction. It's a long-term perspective. You need to invest for more than a generation. And that sense of responsibility and nurturing as capacity building, not simply as getting it right in a very abstract, narrow sense, is now very powerful, already very much integrated into the developmental literature. I think one of the leading scholars or philosophers involved in this is Martha Nussbaum. But in fact, Amartya Sen, in his whole question about development as freedom, has taken a lot of this kind of literature into his own consideration. And needless to say, one particular strength that all the feminist movements underscore is the importance of networking, the importance of community. So we need to think about social capital as well as economic development. Not just economic development and accumulation of economic capital per se, but the cultivation of social capital. We've talked about this before, and there's no question about the importance of networking, social networking, as the accumulation of social capital. And which means capacity building is to build cultural competence, is to raise the level of cultural awareness of the people in general. In other words, education from the feminist point of view is much broader vision of liberal arts education than simply the vocational education based upon a close link between what you learn in terms of the skill and what you'll be able to perform and do in terms of your work, in terms of the workplace. And there's more musical, in a way, more musical to spiritual values. On the surface, these spiritual values or religious values, they're not necessarily integrated into a developmental strategy, but they're important as for social stability, for networking. Now, let's revisit what we've just said. The feminists worried about the Confucian tradition, especially the historical developments of Confucianism. And if you want to single out one axial age civilization as target of attack by some of the very sophisticated feminists, Confucianism seems to be the obvious target. Because in the Confucian tradition, it's patriarchal and patrilineal. Patriarchal meaning that it's male-oriented, especially in terms of family relationships. One of the most central family relationships turn out to the father-son. And even in terms of the human flourishing, the idea of the sage, idea of the worthy, idea of the gentleman, they're all related to the education of the male. I mean, traditionally speaking. And also, there's some kind of a very interesting problem with the Confucian tradition. There's the fear of female power. So what we have is an interesting phenomenon. The assumption that East Asian societies, under the influence of Confucianism, the women are totally oppressed, not able to articulate their own ideas, to play major roles. So that's a misconception, very serious misconception. You may have an ideology which is very concerned, or has tremendous anxiety about the power of women, but the society, in fact, in terms of the power relationship, is not at all a society that totally oppresses women. To give you a few examples, you know how power is really exercised. When I say power exercise, it's exercised through certain kind of ritual. The role of the mother in Confucian society is particularly pronounced. There's no question about the fact. 17th century Confucian thinker urged her son to learn from the two great architects of the Confucian tradition, Confucius and Mencius. Both of them were educated by their mothers. Confucius' father died when Confucius was only 3 years old, and the famous Mencius' mother who educated him. So if you want to find one social role within East Asian societies, that's probably true with Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, that the most important educators in terms of social role in all these societies up to today turn out to be the mother, often the illiterate mother. Now, an illiterate mother could turn out to be culturally extremely sophisticated. So don't confuse cultural sophistication with literacy. And the transmission of Confucian values, especially in terms of character building, through the illiterate mother, through the audio perception of articulating the values. It's very powerful. The wife in the Confucian family is powerful, especially in terms of domestic affairs. Not only the education of the children, but sometimes, I think often, that the financial authority of the domestic arena is controlled by the wife, not by the husband. Husband often will have to travel around. So the financial control. And also in Chinese society, some of the most powerful rulers turn out to be female rulers. Empress Dowager of the Qing dynasty, certainly one of them, but quite a few others. So it is not the case that the society that worried about women's power in the public arena, in fact, was able to control the situation and simply allowing the male-dominated orientation to prevail. So this is an obvious point. And yet, this society, once it collapsed, we know that it collapsed in the 19th century because of the impact of the West. It collapsed because the power of the Enlightenment mentality that undermined the kind of Confucian humanism that we talked about earlier. And yet, ever since the end of the Second World War, in the last 50 years or so, there's the revival of the Confucian tradition. The revival of the Confucian tradition already accepted the Enlightenment of the modern West as the ruling ideology. So there's a powerful scientism, there's a powerful concern for rights, concern for due process of law, and also a very important upsurge of interest in individualism among all these societies. And it is in this particular context, with the emergence of ecological consciousness and now feminist sensitivity, many of the values that we consider have been relegated to the background resurfaced as important values for understanding how the Confucian humanistic orientation can be reconstituted. It is in this sense, you have to, I'm sorry about this shorthand about this change, you have to have some sense of now the possibility of the points for convergence. Without this historical note, it's difficult to understand how this actually developed. The first convergence, as I see, is this: both the Confucian tradition and the feminist tradition put a great deal of emphasis on the idea of the situated self. In other words, the self as contextualized, the contextualization of the self. Self not as an abstract idea, no history, no social context, but the self as understood as a concrete living human being here and now. All the primordial ties we talked about, the local conditions, all the particular concerns about the individual ought to be taken into consideration. So the person is not simply an abstract idea. The person is situated in a particular social context with history, with all the other primordial ties as relevant. And if there's one message in this particular orientation, in Confucian ethics, this should be clear, that the point of departure is always the concrete living person here and now. And the feminists broadly define or accept this particular notion about the idea of the situated self. The other one, actually, to me, is a happy surprise, but increasingly, this has been very widely discussed, about the idea of embodied knowing. To know is not simply a cognitive function of the mind and the head. Not just to think with our head, but how to think with our body. In other words, to have a sense of orientation, a feel, a sense of what's going on. The importance of nonverbal communication. Learning is not simply the acquisition of skills. Learning, broadly defined, is a transformative act to transform ourselves through learning. And that sense of knowing, many people say, I don't think it's scientifically proved or not, scientifically proved yet, that we normally think with one side of the brain. We normally use one side of the brain more pronounced than the other. And there's an argument, which I don't know whether it's true or not, that women exercise both brains more frequently than men because of the networking capacity. We don't know. We know that you study Chinese, for example, as ideograms. You exercise the side of brain different from learning English. For many, many years, there's a notion that you learn the ideogram, then the more you learn, the more you become stupid, because a lot of brain power is being absorbed in this kind of memory exercise, right? So you don't have the capacity to further develop yourself. But more recently, it's a very different argument. If you study some, like diagrams, like ideograms and diagrams of sort, you exercise part of the brain that you normally would not be able to exercise if you only study syllabic languages. And there may be unintended positive contribution to networking in your brain by studying something of this nature. Now we know for sure, this is not an argument, we know for sure that people who study music may turn out to be very, very helpful for mathematics and for some kind of quantitative reasoning. So what's the connection between music and mathematical competences? So the question about learning now, to have a very restricted notion about learning, focusing on the cognitive intelligence, is no longer feasible. I think this whole argument about embodied knowing, knowing not only just simply to use your brain, this is how Zhu Xi asked us how to read. You don't just read by looking at texts and exercising your brain, you read by embodying it. That kind of embodiment, experiential understanding, is very significant. And this also relates to the notion about learning as a way of life. Again, I'm not going to make a specific gender statement whether women are more capable of adjusting to new environments when they grow older than men. But culturally, unfortunately, for men, this is the case. Men are less capable of adjusting to new environments, especially in terms of the ordinary human situation, human life, how to adjust to. We have very good data on this concerning the last 20 or 30 years of Chinese scholars visiting the United States. It's an incredible situation. The overwhelming majority of the women adjusted very well. Overwhelming majority of men adjusted very poorly. That's one example. You look at the Indian data, you look at Thai, you look at many, many data. Now the question is, long-term, lifelong learning is not a focused learning. Lifelong learning as a ceaseless process of learning to be human, to be able to adjust to new situations, to be able to have the second career, the third career, the fourth career. Right now, of course, it's quite common. You will not be able to stay in the same kind of career pattern for long because the economic situation changes. So this adjustment, to be able to adjust to new situations in terms of the total life situation, not just in terms of one's focused career, in terms of professionalism, broadly defined rather than professionalism, narrowly defined. You're not sacrificing professional competence, but you'll be able to adjust to new situations. And then the question about self-realization as a communal act. If you want to find one underlying theme of the most feminist literature that I've examined, is a very powerful critique of individualism, especially excessive individualism. the domination of the person as an isolated individual. This great deal of emphasis on linkages, how you link your own personal experience with the experiences of other people, with the society in general, even with nation and international community. This networking capacity, the network building, is also linked to a pattern of self-realization. The self-realization, this process, is never understood in terms of the trajectory of an isolated individual. It is always understood in terms of relationality. So I think why the word relationship or relationality is so critical now is because the more you enter into the community, the more you expand the network of relationships, the more you try to realize yourself. And that process of learning, the process of communal participation, becomes a defining characteristic of who you are. Perhaps it is in this sense, then maybe we, I don't know how you feel about this contrast. Can you have individualism at the same time without losing sight of the notion that a person is essential relationships? I think most of us probably agree that a person is essential relationships. A person is not an isolated individual, like an island. It's like a flowing stream. But many of you still cherish the idea of individualism. So the challenge, the question for you is that how will you accept the view that as a center of relationship, I am a central relationship, without losing sight of the notion about personal dignity, of individualism? And how do you link the two? How do you develop a notion about the person as essential relationships without losing sight of the idea of the person as, in terms of the dignity of the person? And this linkage from the self to dyadic relationships, variously defined, to the community and broader, is perhaps the reason why one very powerful intellectual traditions now among the feminists turn out to be ecofeminism. We have one article, I hope that you'll read it with care, because that article both gives you a notion about how the Confucian tradition could be critiqued from not just the feminist point of view, but also from the ecological point of view, but at the same time why the tradition can provide some resources for the development of this ecofeminism. Now, in summary, the Confucian tradition has been marginalized by the Enlightenment mentality. And that's one of the reasons why the lack of emphasis on liberty, not enough emphasis on rationality, especially in terms of science and technology, not enough development in the legal constraint of society, law, and not enough emphasis on human rights, and not enough emphasis on the dignity of the individual, all have been identified as major problems for the Confucian tradition to become modern. Assuming, I think we'll agree, assuming that no Confucian in the modern context can deny the importance of liberty. If anyone who is against liberty, then he's against the modern idea. And to say, if you are a Confucian, that you have to accept the view that the dignity of the individual, of the son, is being sacrificed for the dignity of the father, or the dignity of the wife is not as important as the dignity of the husband, or the dignity of the ruler is more important than dignity of the subject. I think this would be a total politicized and abusive use of Confucian authoritarianism. It's not acceptable. To say that a Confucian is not interested in developing, many of the Confucians now become totally committed to a kind of scientism, I call it. So the importance of science and technology, the importance of rationality as an outlook for the modern world. No Confucians can argue against that. In fact, many scholars believe that the great contribution of some of the neo-Confucian thinkers like Zhu Xi is to emphasize the importance of the investigation of things, of rational thinking, of probing the principle inherent in things. And no Confucians can afford not to underscore the importance of rule of law rather than rule by law. It is rule of law rather than rule by law that should be the Confucian commitment to modern development of modern society. And of course, I argued earlier that the human rights discourse is fully accepted by some of the basic Confucian scholars. And even though some people may want to use duty consciousness to argue against rights, I think the way to argue against rights is to say rights can be derived from duty consciousness, but not the other way around. It's not simply the rejection of rights. If we accept all these, which means that we accept Enlightenment mentality as an important part of the modern consciousness, still we can align ourselves in this connection, align ourselves with the feminists in formulating the critique of excessive permissiveness of the liberal tradition with emphasis on justice, with fight against instrumental rationality, especially when it's very narrowly defined in favor of an idea of sympathy, and also to critique litigiousness from the point of view of civility, and also to argue against very narrow-minded use of the idea of rights in favor of a sense of responsibility. In other words, responsibility and rights are not at all in conflict. In other words, we may be able to move to a situation where the feminist critique becomes a resource for the Confucian tradition, and at the same time, the Confucian tradition may provide some resource for feminist thinking or ecological thinking in the future.